She didn't choose him. She was sold to him by the man she thought loved her. Natalie Whitmore walked into a marriage she despised, into a mansion that felt like a prison, into the arms of a man the entire West Coast feared. She told herself she hated Vincent Devereaux. She told herself every single day. But hatred is a strange thing. It keeps you close. It keeps you watching. And sometimes, God help you, it turns into something you never saw coming. This is not a love story. Not at first. First, it's a story about survival, betrayal, and the moment a woman discovers that the monster she married was the only one who ever truly protected her. If this story already has you, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one goes all the way up. The debt notice arrived on a Tuesday. Natalie remembered that detail with ugly precision. The way Tuesday mornings always smelled like burnt coffee and the neighbor's lawnmower 2 houses down. The way the California sun came through the kitchen window at an angle that hit the linoleum just right and made everything look warmer than it actually was. She remembered standing at the kitchen counter in her mother's house, still in her work clothes from the night shift at the hotel, her feet aching inside shoes that had worn thin at the heel, and watching her mother's face go from confused to pale to something Natalie didn't have a word for. Her mother's name was Carol Whitmore. She was 53 years old, with crow's feet she'd earned honestly, and hands that had never been soft a day in her life. Carol was not a woman who scared easily. She had buried a husband, raised 2 daughters on a single income, and kept a house standing through 3 recessions without once asking anyone for help she wasn't prepared to return. So when Natalie watched the color drain out of her mother's face while Carol read that letter, slowly, like she needed to read it twice to believe it, something cold moved through Natalie's chest before she'd even reached for the paper. "Mom." Carol didn't answer. "Mom, what is it?" Carol set the letter on the counter face down. Her hand stayed on top of it, her fingers pressed flat against the paper like she was trying to keep the words from escaping. "It's Jess," Carol said. Jessica Whitmore was 23. She was the kind of beautiful that made strangers look twice and made people who loved her nervous, because beauty like that attracted the wrong kind of attention, and Jessica had never quite developed the instinct to know the difference. She was impulsive where Natalie was careful. She trusted fast. She wanted things immediately and intensely, and without the patience to ask where they came from. Their father used to say Jess got all the fire, and Natalie got all the sense. And he'd said it like it was a compliment to both of them, though now Natalie wondered if he'd understood what fire does to things that can't move out of the way. Jess had been living in San Diego for 8 months. A new job, she'd said. New friends. A fresh start. She'd called twice in those 8 months, both times late at night, both times slightly breathless in the way she got when she was excited about something she wasn't ready to explain yet. Natalie had let herself believe that was good news. She'd let herself believe a lot of things about Jessica because the alternative was too heavy to carry around every day. She picked up the letter. $87,000. $87,000 owed to a company called Pacific Meridian Holdings, which Natalie had never heard of, which had no website she could find in the 22 seconds she spent searching for it on her phone, which had somehow extended her younger sister a loan secured against the Whitmore family home, against their mother's house. Natalie read the number 3 times. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for it to change, maybe. For some clause at the bottom that explained the misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was a signature on the 3rd page that was undeniably Jessica's, looping and impatient, the same signature she'd been writing since she was 16 years old and decided cursive was worth learning after all. "She doesn't know," Carol said. Her voice was flat. Not angry. Something past angry. "She doesn't know they used the house." "Did you know she'd borrowed money?" Carol was quiet for a moment. "She said it was a small loan, a few thousand, for a car payment." Natalie put the letter down. She walked to the window. Outside, the lawnmower had stopped, and the street was very quiet, and the morning light was still lying about how warm the day was going to be. "I'll call Logan," she said. "But son saintamt." Logan Pierce was 29, which was 3 years older than Natalie, and he had a face that photographed well, and a voice that sounded patient even when it wasn't. He was the kind of man who got described as stable by people who didn't know the word they were actually looking for. He and Natalie had been together for 4 years. They had a shared lease on an apartment in Silver Cove, a joint savings account with $11,000 in it, and a standing dinner reservation at the same Thai place every Friday, because Logan didn't like surprises in his routine. He had proposed twice. Natalie had said not yet both times, and he had accepted that with a smile that she'd read his understanding and that she would later, much later, understand had been something else entirely. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, you're up early. I need you to come to my mom's." A pause. "What happened?" "Jess, I'll explain when you get here." He came. He sat at the kitchen table and read the letter and made the kind of sympathetic sounds that Natalie had always found reassuring. And he said all the right things about not panicking, about calling a lawyer, about options. He held her hand. He made fresh coffee. He was, by every visible measure, exactly the person she needed him to be in that moment. She would think about that later. How good he was at being exactly what was needed. How that particular skill, in the right person, is called love, but in other people it's called something different. Kotom. Jessica came home that afternoon. She looked thinner than Natalie remembered, which was the first thing. And the second thing was that she looked frightened in a way she was trying very hard to disguise as annoyance. She denied knowing about the house for approximately 4 minutes before Carol's silence wore her down, and she sat at the kitchen table with her jacket still on and said the money hadn't been for a car. It had started, she said, as a job, a data entry position that paid in cash. The man who'd offered it to her had been friendly and professional, and the office, such as it was, had been a suite in a real building with real furniture, and for the first 2 months everything had been exactly as described. Then they'd asked her to do something she didn't understand, to sign off on transfers, just sign her name. It was nothing. It was paperwork. And she'd been so far in by then, had borrowed from them to cover rent when work was slow, had let the number grow without thinking about the shape it was building toward. And by the time she understood what Pacific Meridian Holdings actually was, the understanding arrived like a door slamming shut behind her. "What are they?" Natalie asked. Jess looked at the table. "I don't know exactly. Jess, I think—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I think they traffic people." The kitchen went very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside a car passed slowly, and its radio was playing something indistinct and bright, the kind of pop song that only exists in the background of moments you'll spend years trying to forget. Carol said nothing. Natalie said, "Are you in danger right now?" Jessica looked up at her with the expression of a person who has been in danger for a while and is exhausted from pretending otherwise. "We all are," she said, "as long as that debt exists." Natalie did not sleep that night. She lay in the apartment she shared with Logan and stared at the ceiling and ran the numbers the way she'd been running them since that afternoon. 11,000 in savings. Her salary, after taxes, was thin. She'd been studying for her real estate license and had cut her hours at the hotel to make time for it. Carol had a retirement account that she couldn't touch without penalties. They could not raise $87,000 legally in the time frame the letter specified, which was 30 days. She turned toward Logan in the dark. "If we sold the car," she said, "and cashed out the savings, it won't be enough." "I know. But if we combined it with a personal loan, Natalie." His voice was gentle. "Those aren't lenders. They're not going to negotiate." "Then what are you saying?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm saying we have to be realistic." She waited for the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence didn't come. She turned back to the ceiling. Somewhere in the space between 2 and 4 in the morning, she made the decision that she was going to find a way to fix this herself, because she had learned by then, though she couldn't have named the lesson, that the people who tell you to be realistic are often the ones with nothing personally at stake. Vincent Devereaux arrived 2 days later. She didn't know he was coming. Her mother called and said a man was at the house who wanted to speak with the family, and Natalie had driven over with her stomach already tight, already anticipating something, though she couldn't have said what. She parked on the street and walked up to a black car she didn't recognize, a car that was too clean and too quiet, and that sat in front of her mother's modest house the way a cathedral sits in a small town. Too large for its surroundings, impossible to ignore. She'd heard the name Vincent Devereaux before. Her father had mentioned it, in the way men of a certain generation mention certain names, with care and with economy, and without ever really explaining the shape of the history behind it. Michael Whitmore had been dead for 6 years. He'd been a longshoreman, then a dock supervisor, then a man who knew a lot of people whose business it wasn't entirely useful to know too well. He'd never talked about Vincent Devereaux in a way that explained who exactly Vincent was, but he talked about him in a way that made Natalie understand the subject was serious. She walked into her mother's house and found him sitting at the kitchen table. He was not what she expected, though she would have struggled to articulate what she had expected. He was perhaps 50, or perhaps a decade younger than that. It was difficult to tell because his face had the quality of a thing that had been built to last rather than built to be looked at. He was large in the shoulders still, and his hair was dark with threads of gray that he wore without apology. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him with the precision of something custom-made, and his hands, which were folded on the table in front of him, were the hands of a man who had done physical work for a long part of his life. He stood when she came in, which surprised her. "Natalie." His voice was low and measured. Not warm exactly, but not cold. Controlled. The voice of a man who chose his words the way other people chose tools. "My name is Vincent Devereaux. I knew your father for many years." "I know who you are," she said. He sat back down. Her mother was standing near the sink with her arms crossed. Not hostile, but not comfortable either. There was a cup of coffee on the table in front of Vincent that appeared untouched. "Your family has a problem," he said. "My family's problem is private." "Your family's problem," he said patiently, "is with people who are known to me, which makes it less private than you'd prefer." He paused. "Pacific Meridian Holdings is a front for an organization I've been tracking for 2 years. The men who run it have no intention of accepting repayment. The debt is a mechanism. It isn't designed to be paid. It's designed to escalate, to create leverage, and eventually to be converted into something other than money." Natalie felt the room tighten. "You're saying they want my sister." "I'm saying they want your sister, and eventually you." He said it without inflection, without apparent emotion, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, not because he doesn't understand the weight of it, but because he knows that softening it doesn't change it. "Your father was a good man. He helped me at a time when very few people were willing to. I don't forget that kind of thing." "What are you offering?" Vincent looked at her steadily. "I'll pay the debt, every dollar. Tonight, if necessary. And I'll dismantle their leverage against your family in a way that ensures they never approach you again." Natalie's chest was tight. "And what do you want?" There it was. The pause that holds everything. The pause she would replay hundreds of times in the months that followed, turning it over like a coin with two sides she didn't fully understand. "I want you to marry me," he said. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Carol made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Natalie stared at him. "You're serious?" "I never say things I don't mean. I'm with someone." "I know." "I don't know you." "I know that too." She waited for something more, for justification, for persuasion, for the kind of elaborate emotional argument that would at least make the proposition feel like a conversation rather than a transaction. He offered nothing else. He sat there with his hands folded and his untouched coffee and his absolute stillness and waited for her to decide. And the infuriating thing, the thing she would carry in her sternum for months, was that he seemed genuinely prepared to accept no as an answer. He wasn't performing patience. He was actually patient, which was somehow worse, because it meant he wasn't trying to take anything from her. He was only making an offer, and her sister was somewhere in the city, frightened and guilty, and waiting to find out what shape the consequence was going to take. Natalie thought about the number. $87,000. 30 days. The house her mother had paid into for 30 years. "Why me?" she asked. Vincent was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully. "Because your father asked me to." Her throat closed. "He came to me years ago, before he was sick. He said—" Vincent paused. It was the first break in his composure, small and fast, but she caught it. "He said he was worried about what would happen to his family if something happened to him. He asked me to watch over you. I've done that at a distance for 6 years. This situation requires something closer. Watching over me doesn't mean marrying me." "No," he agreed, "but this is where we are." Natalie looked at her mother. Carol's face was unreadable, the face of a woman holding herself very still because the alternative was falling apart. And Carol Whitmore had not survived this long by falling apart. Natalie looked back at Vincent. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "what does that actually mean, in practical terms?" "It means you and your sister are protected by my name and my organization. It means Pacific Meridian cannot touch your family. Not now, not in the future. It means you'll live in my home. You'll have financial security I won't ever remove from you. And it means," he held her gaze, "that I won't ask more of you than you're willing to give." That's a vague promise from a very specific kind of man. Something moved in his eyes. It might have been amusement. "I suppose it is. I want it in writing." The corner of his mouth moved barely. "I'll have my attorney draft it tonight." She stood there for a long moment with the weight of every alternative pressing on her from all sides. The hotel job, the real estate license she hadn't finished, the apartment with Logan and the Friday Thai dinners, and the joint account with $11,000 that would evaporate inside a single month against a debt this size. And Jess at 23 with her impulsive trust and her borrowed money and her face in that kitchen chair, pale and scared and trying to look like neither. "Okay," Natalie said. The word came out flat and quiet, a door shutting. "Okay? Yes." She told Logan that night. She sat across from him at the kitchen table in their apartment. Their apartment, she thought, already past tense, and she told him everything, beginning with the letter and ending with the word yes. And she watched his face the whole time because she needed to see what this did to him, needed the evidence of the impact to be able to carry this in the days ahead. Logan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're serious," he said. "Yes." "Natalie." He leaned forward. His voice was still even, still patient. "You don't have to do this. There are other ways to handle money problems. Not this kind of debt, not with these people. You don't actually know what these people are. You're taking his word for it." "I looked it up. Pacific Meridian Holdings doesn't exist as a legitimate company. There's no record of—" "You're about to marry a man you've never met," Logan said, and his voice had shifted just slightly, a tightening underneath the patience, "to solve a problem that your sister created. My family's problem. Yes. And what about us? What about our plans? What about—" He stopped. He was gripping the edge of the table lightly, his knuckles not quite white. "You're throwing away everything we've built." "Logan, I don't have a choice. You always have a choice." He looked at her. His eyes were brown and very clear, and she had always thought of them as kind eyes, had cataloged them under kind from the very beginning. "I'm asking you to make a different one." She waited. She waited for him to say what she needed him to say, that he would figure it out with her, that they would face this together, that he would put $11,000 and his own credit rating and his own comfort on the line for her family. She waited for the kind eyes to back themselves up with something. He said, "You can't save everyone, Natalie." She stood up. She didn't slam anything. She didn't cry, or not yet, not in front of him. She took her coat off the hook by the door, and she picked up her keys, and she said very quietly, "I'm not trying to save everyone, just 2 people." She left. The wedding was small. The word small was generous. It was a private ceremony in the office of a civil attorney, with Carol and a man named Garrett, who appeared to be Vincent's attorney, as the only witnesses. Natalie wore a dress she'd already owned, a blue one she'd bought for a coworker's going-away party 8 months ago. She had not told Jess what she was doing until the day before, and Jess had cried, which was the thing Natalie had most wanted to avoid, because when Jess cried, it meant the situation had weight enough to bring her to her knees, and Natalie needed to be able to pretend, at least briefly, that the weight was manageable. Vincent wore a dark suit. He was quiet throughout. He signed the paperwork with the same economy of motion he seemed to apply to everything, and he shook the attorney's hand and he opened the car door for Natalie without being asked, which was so instinctive it clearly came from somewhere old in him, some habit worn smooth by years. She sat in the passenger seat of his car and watched Silver Cove pass outside the window and felt the strange, weightless sensation of a life that had just shifted its axis. "You don't have to talk," he said. She hadn't been about to. "But I want you to know," he continued, eyes on the road, "that the agreement stands regardless of how you feel about any of this. You won't be pressured. You won't be watched within the house. You'll have your own rooms, your own space. The staff are there to help you, not to report on you. How many staff? 4, full-time. You can add more or reduce them. Your choice. I don't need 4 people watching me live. Then tell them that. They'll adjust. She looked at his profile, the flat line of his jaw, the way he drove without tension, hands easy on the wheel, like a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the road. Do you actually believe this is going to work? She asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it probably didn't deserve. I believe we'll manage, he said. It was not a romantic answer. It was, she thought, an honest one. The mansion was on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, set back from the coastal road behind a gate and a quarter-mile of landscaped drive. It was not a house. It was a statement, though the statement was quieter than she'd expected. Stone and glass and native California planting, nothing ostentatious, nothing shouting money. The money was present the way cold is present in certain rooms. You felt it before you saw evidence of it. He showed her through the main floor without ceremony, pointing out rooms with the brevity of a man who'd given this tour before or had never thought the tour needed to be given at all. The kitchen, the library, the study he would be using that she was welcome to avoid. The room he'd had prepared for her was on the east side of the second floor, with a view of the water and a bathroom that was larger than the living room she'd shared with Logan. The room next to yours is mine, he said. The door between has a lock on your side. It's been installed already. She looked at him. I told you, he said. The agreement stands. She nodded. She didn't thank him because the gratitude would have felt like capitulation, like she'd accepted the terms as fair rather than as survivable, and she was not ready to accept them as anything other than what they were. He left her at the door to her room and walked back down the hall without looking back. She stood in the doorway of the most beautiful room she had ever been given and felt a grief she couldn't entirely locate. For Logan, maybe, or for the version of Logan she'd believed in. For the apartment and the ordinary Friday dinners and the ordinary future she'd been assembling piece by piece. For the version of herself who had been, until Tuesday, someone whose worst problem was the pace of her real estate study. She walked to the window and stood with her hand on the glass and looked at the Pacific, which was the same Pacific she'd grown up looking at, gray-blue and enormous and completely indifferent, and she told herself what she always told herself when the ground shifted, that she was still standing, that standing was enough, that from standing, other things were possible. She believed it less than she usually did. The first week passed in a kind of careful parallel. Vincent was present in the house the way weather is present. You were aware of it without it being directed at you. He ate breakfast early and was often gone before she came down. He returned in the evenings, and occasionally they occupied the same rooms without speaking, which she had expected to feel hostile, and instead felt simply neutral, 2 people sharing space without the pressure of performance. She called Jess twice. The debt was gone, cleared overnight, exactly as promised, a thing that had weighed 87,000 pounds on the family and was now simply absent, like a storm that had moved on. Jess didn't know how to talk about it. She kept saying it was too much, which was not wrong, but wasn't the right framing either, because the question of whether it was too much had already been decided by circumstances that didn't consult anyone's comfort. On the 4th day, one of the staff, a woman named Rosa, compact and efficient, and apparently unbothered by the strangeness of a household where the married couple hadn't yet had a real conversation, told Natalie that Mr. Devereaux had left an account in her name at a bank in town and she was welcome to use it without restriction. Natalie found Vincent in his study that afternoon. He looked up from his desk. He had reading glasses on, which she hadn't expected, and he took them off with a mild, unembarrassed motion when she came in. The account, she said. Yes. I'm not going to use it. He set down his glasses. All right. I have my own money. I have a job. I'm keeping the job. That's your choice. She waited for the argument, the explanation of why she didn't need to keep working or why it might be complicated, or why the job at the hotel was beneath the dignity of whatever she was now. None of that came. He picked his glasses back up, cast a brief look down at the papers in front of him, and then looked back at her. His eyes were gray. She hadn't noticed that before. Was there something else? He asked. Not dismissive, just a question. No, she said. That's all. She left. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and breathed slowly. She'd been preparing for a fight. She'd been carrying the fight with her all afternoon, had structured it in her head, had anticipated the points he'd make and mapped the points she'd return. The absence of the fight left her off balance, in a way she didn't know what to do with. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and made herself acknowledge, alone and without comfort, the quiet and disorienting reality that this man was not what she had been prepared to resist. The second week, a car arrived and Logan was in it. She hadn't called him. He must have gotten the address from someone, from Jess probably, though Jess denied it later with so much emphasis that the denial itself was suspicious. He was parked outside the gate when she came back from the hotel, and he got out of his car when he saw hers, and he looked the same, exactly the same brown eyes, and the same patient voice, and the same face that photographed well. Natalie. He put his hands in his pockets. It was a careful gesture. Just talk to me. Logan, 5 minutes, that's all. You owe me 5 minutes. I don't owe you anything. He flinched. She hadn't meant it as brutally as it landed. You disappeared, he said. You made a decision that affected both of us, and you didn't give me a chance to what? She was tired. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of holding a life together by the outermost edges. I gave you a chance, Logan. I told you exactly what was happening, and I waited for you to say something worth hearing. I was trying to protect you. From my own choice. From a man who... He stopped, looked past her at the gate, at the house barely visible on the bluff. Do you know what he is? Yes. And that doesn't... He kept his word. She looked at Logan directly. The evening light was behind him, and his face was slightly in shadow, and she thought about the 4 years and the Friday dinners and the careful, patient voice. The debt is gone. My family is safe. Everything he promised, he's delivered. Logan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not grief, not quite. Something that looked like calculation, though she would not have named it that. Not yet. Come back, he said. We'll figure out the money together. It's done. Natalie. It's done, Logan. She opened the gate with the code Vincent had given her, and she stepped through it, and she did not look back, and the gate closed with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence she had not written but could not unwrite. She walked up the long drive alone. Inside the house, from the study window, a set of gray eyes watched the car at the gate for a moment before the curtain was released and the room returned to its quiet. Natalie didn't know about the eyes in the window. She didn't know what they saw in Logan's posture as he stood at the gate. She didn't know what Vincent already knew, had already known for longer than she could have imagined, about the careful, patient man she'd spent 4 years trusting. She walked through the front door of the house on the bluff, and she set her keys on the hall table, and she breathed. Standing, she told herself, still standing. She did not know yet that the ground was still moving beneath her, that everything she thought she had already survived was only the first tremor, and that the real earthquake, the one that would strip every assumption down to its studs, hadn't started yet. Outside, Logan Pierce sat in his car for 2 minutes after the gate closed. He was not crying. His face, in the falling light, was unreadable. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. He didn't say hello. He said, "She's inside. It's going to take longer than we thought." A voice on the other end said something brief. Logan said, "I know. I'll stay close." He ended the call. He started the car. He drove away from the mansion on the bluff, back into Silver Cove, back into the ordinary evening streets where nobody knew his name meant anything other than what it appeared to mean. And in the house on the bluff, Natalie Whitmore, Natalie Devereaux now, though she would resist that name for weeks, went upstairs to her room and stood at the window with her hand on the glass and watched the Pacific, enormous and indifferent, and had no idea that the man she'd spent 4 years loving had just handed her, like a package, to the people who wanted her destroyed. 3 weeks into the marriage, Natalie started noticing the silences. Not the silences between herself and Vincent. Those she had cataloged and filed, had accepted as the operating texture of a household built on transaction rather than feeling. Those silences had shape and dimension, and she'd learned to move through them the way you learn to move through a familiar dark room. What she started noticing were the other silences, the kind that existed around Vincent rather than between them. The way a room adjusted when he entered it. The way his staff, Rosa, the two security men whose names she'd learned were Cal and Brennan, the groundskeeper who seemed to double as something else, moved with a specific calibrated awareness of where he was at all times without appearing to watch him. She mentioned it to no one because there was no one to mention it to. She had kept her job at the hotel, which was a small daily act of self-definition that she held on to with more intensity than the action itself warranted. She drove herself there and drove herself back in the normalcy of it. The punched clock, the worn carpet in the break room, the coworker named Delia who complained about her feet and brought homemade tamales on Thursdays, was the ballast that kept the rest of the week from tilting too far in directions she didn't have names for yet. It was at the hotel, on a Thursday with the smell of Delia's tamales still in the break room, that she first saw the photograph. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been scrolling through her phone in the 5 minutes before her shift ended, the mindless kind of scrolling that isn't looking for anything specific, when the name Devereaux caught her eye in a social media post shared by a local news aggregate. The post was 3 months old. It was a photograph taken outside a restaurant in San Francisco, a well-lit place, visible signage, the kind of candid that gets taken without permission. And in it, Vincent was walking beside a woman. The woman was extraordinary. There was no more precise or honest word for it. She was tall and pale, with dark hair cut short against her jaw, and a face that had been assembled with the precision of something designed rather than born. High cheekbones, a mouth that was slightly too wide, eyes that even in a photograph from across a street conveyed the impression of someone who was paying very close attention to everything and finding most of it insufficient. She was wearing a dress that cost more than Natalie's car. She had her hand on Vincent's arm in a way that was not possessive so much as proprietary. The hand of a woman who places things where she wants them and expects them to remain. The caption read, "Vincent Devereaux and Victoria Sinclair, trouble in paradise for the West Coast's most dangerous couple?" Natalie stared at the photograph for a long time. She told herself what she felt was not jealousy. She was quite certain it was not jealousy. It was something more structural than that, a reminder of the architecture of this arrangement, that she had entered a life that had existing furniture, existing history, existing entanglements that she hadn't been given inventory of. She closed the app and put her phone in her pocket and finished her shift and drove home and walked into the house and found Rosa in the kitchen and said, with the measured tone of someone asking about the weather, "Who is Victoria Sinclair?" Rosa stopped what she was doing. It was a small stop, a brief arrest of motion, but Natalie had become, in the past 3 weeks, very attentive to small things in this house. "Where did you hear that name?" Rosa asked. "Online. A photograph." Rosa looked at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warning and occupied an uncomfortable position between the two. "You should ask Mr. Devereaux." "I'm asking you, Miss Natalie." Rosa's voice was patient and immovable, the voice of a woman who had held this household's confidences for a long time and was not about to redistribute them lightly. "Ask Mr. Devereaux." She didn't ask him that night. She sat across from him at the dinner table, but they had fallen into eating dinner at the same time, not together exactly, not in any way that deserved the warmth that word implied, but in the same room at the same hour, which was something. And she ate her food and watched him the way she'd been watching him for 3 weeks, and tried to find the shape of Victoria Sinclair somewhere in the terrain of his face. She found nothing. He was contained the way certain buildings are contained, not cold, not impenetrable, but built to function without exposure. "I saw a photograph," she said. He looked up. "Of you and a woman named Victoria Sinclair." He set down his fork. "Where?" "Online. A news post." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't look away. "Victoria and I have a history," he said. "I gathered that." It ended. "When?" Another pause. Not evasive. She was learning to read his pauses as genuine processing rather than avoidance. "Before you and I spoke. Before the arrangement. And she knows that?" Something shifted in his face, very slight. "Victoria has her own understanding of things." Natalie set her own fork down. "I need a cleaner answer than that." "Victoria Sinclair is the kind of woman," Vincent said carefully, "who decides when things end. I made that decision without her input. She hasn't accepted it. That sounds like a problem." It's managed. That's not the same as resolved. He looked at her with those gray eyes that gave very little away and said, "No, it isn't." And then he picked his fork back up, which was either an ending to the conversation or the most infuriating thing she'd encountered in this house, and she spent the next 20 minutes unable to determine which. Victoria Sinclair arrived on a Saturday. She did not ring the gate. She had a code, which Natalie discovered afterward, and which Vincent also discovered afterward. Rosa told him, tight-lipped and displeased, and she drove up the bluff road in a white car and walked into the house through the front door at 10 in the morning while Natalie was in the kitchen with both hands in bread dough, which was something she'd started doing in this house as a physical outlet for the low-grade electrical charge that had taken up permanent residence in her chest. She heard heels on the marble floor before she heard anything else. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway. Up close, in daylight, she was somehow more than the photograph had prepared for. Not because she was more beautiful, which she was, but because she was more present. She filled space differently than other people. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Natalie's flour-dusted hands and the bowl of dough on the counter and the ordinary domestic scene of it with an expression of barely contained amusement. "You must be Natalie," she said. Her voice was low and precisely modulated, the voice of a woman who had practiced knowing exactly how she sounded at all times. Natalie's hands were still in the dough. She didn't remove them. "You must be Victoria. I see Vincent told you about me. He mentioned you. I'm sure he kept it brief." Victoria walked to the kitchen island and set her bag down with the ease of a woman setting her bag down in her own kitchen. "He keeps everything brief. It's one of his least charming qualities." She looked around the kitchen with an appraising slowness, cataloging, pricing. "You've made changes." "I live here." "Of course you do." Victoria looked at her. Her eyes were dark and very sharp, and they moved over Natalie with the specific thoroughness of a woman deciding how seriously to take another woman. "I'm not here to make trouble. I want you to know that." "People who aren't here to make trouble," Natalie said, "don't let themselves in through a gate code they shouldn't still have." Victoria's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like an acknowledgement. "Fair point." She tilted her head. "I just needed to see." "See what?" "Whether you were real." She said it without cruelty, which almost made it worse. "Vincent has a tendency to solve problems with the most extreme available solution. I needed to understand whether this," she gestured, a small, elegant motion that took in Natalie and the kitchen and the house and the marriage, "was a solution or something else." "Something else like what?" Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "That's the interesting question, isn't it?" Vincent appeared in the kitchen doorway behind her. Natalie didn't know how long he'd been there. He was fully dressed, jacket on, the picture of a man who had not been caught off guard, which she suspected was always intentional. "Victoria?" His voice carried no particular heat. Victoria turned. She looked at him with an expression that Natalie couldn't fully decode. Layered, private, the expression of someone looking at a place they used to live. "Vincent, you need to leave. I just arrived. The code has been changed. Your security clearance is revoked. If you come back to this property without invitation, I'll treat it as a security issue." He said all of this without raising his voice. It was more threatening for the flatness, the way a straight horizon line can be more ominous than a jagged one because it means there's no shelter anywhere on it. Victoria picked up her bag. She walked toward the doorway and Vincent moved to one side to let her pass. As she did, she turned her head slightly and spoke in a voice low enough that it was ostensibly private but precisely calculated to reach Natalie anyway. "Ask him about Hawaii," she said, and then she was gone. "Ask him about Hawaii." Natalie turned the sentence over in her hands for the rest of the day, not because she believed Victoria Sinclair was a trustworthy source, but because the delivery had been too precise to be random, unprompted, aimed. The way you name a specific location when you know the location means something. She didn't ask Vincent about Hawaii. Not yet. She put the sentence in a drawer and closed the drawer and went back to her bread and her shifts at the hotel, and the careful routine of a life that was functioning without quite living. But the sentence was there. It was Jess who told her about Hawaii, though not in the way Victoria had intended. Jess had been doing better, or performing better, which with Jess was sometimes the same thing and sometimes deeply not. She'd started a new job, administrative work for a small property management firm, and she'd moved back into their mother's house while she found her footing. She came to the mansion on a Sunday afternoon, the first time she'd been willing to come, and Natalie watched her walk through the rooms with wide eyes that she was trying not to let be wide. They sat on the back terrace with the ocean below them. "This is insane," Jess said. "I know." Like cinematically insane. She looked out at the water. "Are you okay?" "I'm managing." "That's not the same as okay." "No." Natalie looked at her sister's profile. The same jaw, different expression, Jess always more visible on the surface than Natalie had ever let herself be. "Are you?" "I'm—" Jess stopped. She turned her coffee cup in both hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what I put us through, all of us. You didn't know what they were. I knew something was off. I let myself not look at it." Her voice was flat with the particular flatness of honest self-assessment. "I wanted the money, and I decided not to ask hard questions, and that's on me." She paused. "Vincent's people dismantled the whole operation. Did you know that? Not just our debt. The whole Pacific Meridian network. It's gone." Natalie looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Cal told me, the security guy. He mentioned it." Jess glanced at her. "You didn't know? He doesn't exactly—" Natalie paused. "He doesn't offer information. Maybe you should ask for it." "Jess, I'm not saying—" Jess held up a hand. "I'm not telling you how to feel about any of this. I know what it cost you. I know what you gave up." Her voice dipped. "Logan called me." Natalie went still. "He said he wanted to reconnect. Said he missed you and he was worried and asked if you were happy." Jess watched Natalie's face carefully. "I told him you were fine and not to call me again." "Thank you." "He called again anyway." Jess's eyes were very direct. "Natalie, something about those calls felt wrong to me. He was asking questions that didn't feel like missing someone questions. He wanted to know about the house, about Vincent's schedule. The terrace was quiet except for the wind off the water and the sound of the Pacific below." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I don't know anything anyway." Jess paused. "But I think you should tell Vincent." "I don't have evidence of anything." "You have a feeling." "Feelings aren't—" "Natalie." Jess said her name with the flat intensity of a woman who has recently been wrong about something in a way that cost her family enormously and has decided she will not make that category of error again. "Tell him." She told him that night. She found him in the study and stood in the doorway and said, "Logan has been calling Jess and asking about your schedule and the property." Vincent looked up from his desk. He did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, very slightly more still than usual, the way water goes still before something moves through it. "How many times?" "At least twice that she told me about." "When did the first call happen?" "About 2 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. He didn't reach for his phone or call anyone in. He just sat with the information for a moment, and the quality of his stillness was different from his ordinary stillness. Denser, more purposeful, like a man who has just confirmed something he'd already suspected, and is now deciding what to do with the confirmation. "You already knew," Natalie said. He didn't deny it. "I had a suspicion." "About Logan?" "About who Logan works for." The room shifted. Natalie stepped fully inside it for the first time since she'd appeared in the doorway, as though the sentence required her to be on solid ground to receive it properly. "What does that mean?" Vincent looked at her with those gray eyes that gave little away, and that she was beginning, slowly, to read not as coldness, but as care of a very particular kind. The care of a man who has learned that information, delivered wrong, does more damage than the facts themselves. "There are things I need to confirm before I tell you the full picture," he said. "That's not good enough." "I know." "Vincent." She said his name for what she realized in that moment was the first time she'd said it as a direct address rather than as a label. Something changed in his face when she did. Something very small and very quick. "What is Logan involved in?" "The organization that created your sister's debt," he said quietly. "I believe Logan Pierce is connected to it. Not peripherally, centrally." The air went out of the room. She stood there and let the sentence do what sentences like that do, which is rearrange everything, every memory, every moment, everything she'd understood as one shape and now had to understand as something entirely different. 4 years. 4 years of brown eyes and patient voice and Friday dinners, and not yet to 2 proposals and a savings account with $11,000 she'd thought of as ours. He set up my sister, she said. Vincent said nothing. Saying nothing was, she understood, his version of yes. He was in the apartment with me. When the letter came, he was there. Her voice was very even. She was working hard to keep it even. He said to be realistic. He needed you to feel like there was no option. To feel like the only option was... She stopped. Something cold was moving through her chest, the specific cold of understanding arriving too late. He needed me to have to marry you. Vincent's jaw tightened. That's what I believe. Why? Why would he... Because I am the only target large enough, Vincent said, to be worth the setup. Someone wanted access to this house, to my schedule, to my network structure, and the most direct route to that was through the woman I married. Natalie stared at him. He used me as a key. Yes. She walked to the window. She put her hand on the glass the way she always did when the ground moved. The same instinct, the same cold glass under her palm. The Pacific was very dark tonight and very large and absolutely indifferent. How long have you known? I've suspected for 6 weeks. I've been building confirmation. 6 weeks? She turned to look at him. We've been in the same house for 3 weeks. Yes. You didn't tell me. I needed to be certain before I told you that the man you spent 4 years with was... He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for yet, something careful and something else underneath the careful. I needed to be certain, he said again, before I asked you to carry that. The room was very quiet. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself look in 3 weeks of careful parallel living, and tried to find the shape of a man who had known this about her life for longer than she had, and had kept it with the kind of silence that was not deception but protection, and had also, 6 weeks ago, seen the shape of what Logan Pierce was and had not run, had not sent her back, had not used it as leverage. She did not know what to do with what she found. Outside, the gate alarm tripped. Cal's voice came through the house intercom, clipped and professional. Mr. Devereaux, we have a vehicle outside, unregistered plates. It's been parked for 11 minutes. Vincent was out of his chair and moving before the sentence finished. Natalie stood at the window with her hand on the glass and watched the black water below and felt the ground shift again beneath her. Not the slow geological shift of the past 3 weeks, but something faster now, something with velocity, the kind of movement that doesn't announce its direction until you're already inside it. The intercom crackled. Cal again, his voice pressed flat with the specific discipline of someone delivering information they do not want to deliver. Sir? The driver's been identified. It's someone from your watch list, name flagged as Adrian Hayes. The name meant nothing to Natalie. She would not be able to say that for much longer. The name Adrian Hayes sat in the air of the intercom like smoke after a shot. Present, dispersing, impossible to call back. Vincent was already in the hallway when Natalie moved from the window. She followed him without deciding to, the way you follow a current before you've registered that you're moving. He was walking fast but not running. The measured speed of a man who has trained himself not to communicate urgency through his body, because urgency, communicated through the body, becomes panic in the people around you, and panic is a liability he could not afford. Cal met them at the end of the main corridor, compact, dark-eyed, the kind of man who carries stillness the same way Vincent did, learned rather than natural. He had a radio clipped to his belt and his jacket was open in the specific way that meant he was wearing something under it. Same vehicle, Cal said. He moved once, repositioned 50 meters north, still outside visual from the front cameras, but Brennan has eyes on him from the eastern corner. Plates confirmed stolen, registered to a vehicle reported missing in Sacramento 8 months ago. Vincent stopped walking. He turned his head and looked at Natalie, who had followed him this far and was now standing in the corridor with her arms crossed over her chest, not because she was cold, but because it was the only container she had for what was happening in her sternum. Go upstairs, he said. No. His jaw moved. Natalie, who is Adrian Hayes? Cal looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at Natalie. Something passed between them. Not the look of a man deciding whether to lie, but the look of a man deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "A name from my past," he said. "That's not an answer. It's what I have right now." He held her gaze for 1 second, 2. "Go upstairs. Lock the room. This is not a request." She went. Not because she accepted the authority of it. She didn't, not entirely. But because she was smart enough to understand that standing in a corridor arguing while a man with stolen plates sat outside the gate was not the version of this situation that served anyone. She went upstairs. She did not lock the door. She stood at the window of her room with the light off and looked down at the drive and the gate and the dark edge of the coastal road beyond it, and breathed slowly through her nose and tried to think. Adrian Hayes. The name had no shape for her. It landed without weight, without context, without the kind of resonance that names acquire when they belong to people you've encountered. It was simply a name that had caused Vincent Devereaux to move from his chair in a way that suggested he'd been waiting, without knowing how long he'd been waiting, for exactly this. Below, she could see Cal and Brennan moving in the dark. Professional, coordinated, unhurried, in the way that meant they were not surprised, only activated. The vehicle on the road was invisible from this angle. After 20 minutes, it was gone. Brennan's voice, faint through a radio somewhere below her, confirming the vehicle had departed north on the coastal road. Vincent appeared in her doorway at 11:15. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with the light still off. He found the switch himself, turned it on at the lowest setting, and stood in the middle of the room with his jacket still on and looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her more frequently in the past week. The careful look, the one that contained something he was calibrating how to release. "He's gone," Vincent said. "For now." "Yes, for now." She looked at him. "Tell me who he is." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. He moved to the chair near the window, her chair, the one she sat in to look at the water, and he sat in it the way a large man sits in a small space, slightly constrained, slightly formal, and he laced his hands together and looked at the floor briefly before looking back at her. "His name is Adrian Hayes," he said. "His father's name was Richard Hayes. Richard was an associate of mine for approximately 7 years. He managed money, laundering primarily, through a series of real estate fronts in Northern California." Vincent paused. Richard was not a loyal man. 12 years ago, he made an agreement with a federal task force. He agreed to provide testimony against several members of my organization in exchange for immunity and relocation. Natalie listened. "The testimony was damaging. 3 of my people went to prison. The organization took years to rebuild." He said this without heat, without the self-pity that the story might have justified in another man. He was reporting. "I discovered the agreement before Richard could complete his testimony. I confronted him. There was a meeting that went wrong." Another pause, longer this time. "Richard Hayes died in that meeting. You killed him." "I didn't pull the trigger. One of my men did, without my instruction, in a situation that deteriorated faster than I could contain it." His voice was measured. "I've spent 12 years with the weight of that. Richard Hayes made choices that damaged a great many people, but he was a father, and his son was 17 years old when he died. And that is not something that can be argued away into something more comfortable." Natalie looked at her hands in her lap. "And the son blames you." "The son has blamed me for 12 years. He was relocated with his mother after Richard's death. I lost track of them. He's apparently spent the intervening time building toward something." Vincent looked at her directly. "I don't know the full shape of what he's planning. What I know is that he's been in Silver Cove for at least 3 months. What I know is that Logan Pierce's connection to Pacific Meridian connects, through 2 intermediaries, to a financial account that traces back to a holding company registered in Adrian Hayes' name." The room went very quiet. Natalie heard the sentence assemble itself inside her the way sentences like this one do. Slowly, piece by piece, each word adding weight until the whole thing was so heavy she could feel it in her spine. "He funded it," she said. "Pacific Meridian. The debt. Jess." "Yes." "He engineered the situation that brought me into this house." "Yes, because I'm—" She stopped. The word for what she was in this construction was not a word she wanted to say. She said it anyway, because not saying it would have been a kind of cowardice she didn't have room for right now. I'm bait. Vincent said nothing. She had learned by now that his silences were not absences. They were presences of a specific kind. He used Logan, she said. Logan used my sister. My sister's debt brought me here. She looked at Vincent and felt something cold and very clear move through her. The specific clarity of a person who has just seen the architecture of a thing that was built around them without their knowledge. The whole structure was designed to put me in this house so that he'd have access to you. That is what I believe. And Victoria? Vincent's jaw tightened. I don't know the full extent of Victoria's involvement yet. She may have been a coincidence. She may not have been. Natalie stood up. She needed to stand, needed the physical fact of her own feet on the floor, her own body vertical and present and occupying space that was hers. She walked to the window and looked at the dark water below and breathed. She had been a mechanism. From the very beginning, from before the letter, maybe, from before Jess took the job in San Diego, she had been a moving piece in a structure built by a man she'd never heard of to destroy a man she hadn't met. And Logan, whom she had trusted for 4 years, whose proposals she had considered, whose voice she had let herself be soothed by in the dark, Logan had been the hand that placed her where she needed to be. She turned around. I want to meet him, she said. Vincent looked at her. Adrian Hayes, I want to... That is not going to happen. He used me. He used my sister. He used... Natalie. Vincent stood. He was very large in the room when he stood, not threatening, but present in a way that was difficult to argue past. The moment you are in a room with Adrian Hayes, every piece of leverage he has increases by a factor I cannot manage. You are not a confrontation asset. You are the thing I am trying to keep safe. I'm not a thing. I know that. His voice dropped. I know exactly what you are, which is why I'm telling you this instead of letting you walk into a situation that ends badly. She stared at him. Her chest was tight with the specific tightness of a person who is being protected in a way that also constrains them, and who cannot entirely argue with the protection without arguing with the constraint, and cannot entirely accept the constraint without losing something she needed to keep. What are you going to do? She asked. Find out the full picture? Dismantle the financial structure before he can use it. Remove the pieces that give him leverage. And Logan, Vincent's face was flat and still. Logan Pierce is being handled. She didn't ask what that meant. She understood, standing in this room in this house with this man, that there were registers of the word handled that she did not want defined for her in precise terms, and that understanding was itself a kind of accommodation. She would have rejected 3 weeks ago, which told her something about how much she had changed in 3 weeks that she hadn't been monitoring closely enough. She nodded once. She turned back to the window. After a moment, she heard him leave. The Hawaii trip was Victoria's idea, which was the first sign Natalie should have read more carefully. It came through an intermediary, a message from a woman named Claire, who managed social arrangements for several of Vincent's corporate fronts, delivered with the breezy efficiency of someone who regularly coordinated things that other people called impossible. A private travel package to Maui. A villa, a week, arranged by Victoria Sinclair as, the message said, a gesture of goodwill and an apology for the gate incident. Natalie's first instinct was no. Her second instinct, arriving 3 seconds behind the first, was that saying no to everything indefinitely was its own kind of prison, and she had not signed up for a life conducted entirely inside the walls of a bluffside mansion while the world continued to exist and move and happen without her. She told Vincent. He was quiet for a long time. Victoria doesn't make gestures of goodwill. I know. This is a move. I know that too. She looked at him across the dinner table. But I haven't left this house for anything other than my hotel shifts in 3 weeks. I'm not built for this kind of... She gestured at the mansion, the walls, the careful, monitored life of it. Stasis. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him working through it, the risk calculation, the variables. She could see him wanting to say no. Cal goes with you, he said. Fine. He stays close. Non-negotiable. Fine. And you don't... He stopped. He picked up his glass and set it down again without drinking from it, which was, she had learned, his version of a full emotional stop. If anything feels wrong, you leave, Immediately. You don't try to reason it out or wait to be sure. You leave. Vincent? I mean it. I understand. She looked at him. I'll be careful. He nodded. He looked at his plate. Something in his posture held the specific tension of a man who has just agreed to something he believes is a mistake, but respects the person enough to make it anyway. And she found that, in the complicated ledger of this marriage, that particular form of respect landed somewhere she hadn't expected. Maui was real in the way that places you've only seen in photographs are always slightly shocking when you inhabit them. The air tasted different, weighted with salt and something floral, and the light had a quality that made everything it touched look significant. The villa was on the north shore, set back from a beach of dark volcanic sand, and it was absurd in its beauty, and Natalie walked through it with Cal 3 steps behind her and thought about the hotel in Silver Cove and the worn carpet in the break room and almost laughed. She did not laugh. She unpacked. She called her mother. She called Jess, who said, "Oh my God," 4 times in succession when Natalie described the view from the lanai. She felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The physical sensation of distance from the thing that had been pressing on her. She met Ethan Walker on the second day. He was at a coffee place near the harbor, not a tourist spot, a working local place with a screen door that stuck, and a woman behind the counter who knew everyone's order, and he was sitting at the corner table with a book and a cup that had gone cold, the way people sit when they're reading something that makes them forget to drink. He was tall and lean, with the kind of easy handsomeness that doesn't seem to know it's handsome. Sandy hair, slightly too long, the look of a man who had spent time outdoors without making it a statement. He looked up when she came in and gave her the brief, acknowledging nod of one solo traveler to another. They ended up talking. Not immediately. The screen door stuck and he got up to help her with it. A simple instinctive motion, no performance in it, and she said thank you and ordered her coffee and was almost back to not talking to him when he said mildly, "Good book?" about the dog-eared paperback she was carrying, and she said it was, and then they were talking. It was easy in the way that talking to people you'll never see again is easy. He was from Portland, traveled for work, which he described in the vague terms of someone in consulting. Not evasive, just uninterested in his own professional identity. He'd been in Maui for 2 weeks and was leaving Sunday. He asked good questions and listened to the answers in a way that felt genuine, not performed. And he made her laugh twice with a dry, unhurried humor that reminded her of no one she'd known before, which was part of what made it feel safe. Cal was at a table by the window. His coffee was hot. His eyes moved through the room at regular intervals. Ethan was pleasant and easy and entirely uncomplicated, and Natalie understood, even as she enjoyed the conversation, that she was enjoying it primarily because everything else in her life had become so complicated that simple human warmth felt like water in a dry month. She saw him again on the 3rd day, on the beach, coincidentally. She saw him on the 4th day at a market near the harbor, which was beginning to feel less coincidental, and she noticed that and decided it was a small island and a tourist town. And these things happen. He asked if she wanted to have dinner. She thought about saying no. She said yes. Cal sat 2 tables away at the restaurant. Ethan glanced at him once, and she said, "Security. It's a thing." And he accepted that with the equanimity of a man who had perhaps encountered things before that required acceptance. Over dinner, he was warmer, more present. He leaned forward in the way people lean when they're genuinely interested, when the distance they normally keep from strangers has contracted. And he looked at her with attention that was not predatory, but was specific. The attention of a person who has decided you are worth paying attention to. And she felt the warmth of it like sunlight on skin that hadn't been warm in a while, and told herself it was harmless, and almost believed it. On the walk back to the villa, he stopped at an overlook above the dark water, and they stood together in the comfortable silence of people who have gotten comfortable with each other faster than the timeline usually allows. And she thought, this is fine. This is just 2 people looking at the same ocean. This means nothing. He said quietly, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask." "Are you running from something or toward something?" She looked at the water. "What makes you think it's one or the other?" "Because you look like someone who made a decision they haven't made peace with yet." She was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific read from a week of coffee and one dinner. I'm a specific reader. He said it without arrogance, just a fact. He turned to look at her, and his face in the dark was open and attentive and completely, entirely legible. I'm not asking you to explain it. I just want you to know I see it. Something moved in her chest. Not desire, not exactly. Something older and more fundamental than that. The thing that moves when someone sees you accurately after a long period of being seen as a function rather than a person. She said, "Thank you for dinner," and meant it as more than dinner. He smiled. "Same time tomorrow?" She said she'd think about it, which they both understood to mean yes. She walked the rest of the way to the villa and went inside and stood in the beautiful, absurd kitchen and called Vincent. He answered on the second ring, the way he always answered, like he'd been waiting without making a performance of waiting. "How is it?" he asked. "Fine." "Good." "The North Shore is beautiful." "Good." A pause. She could hear the study in the background of his voice, the specific quiet of that room. "Everything all right there?" she asked. "Yes, manageable." She thought about asking about Adrian Hayes, about Logan, about the financial structures he was dismantling. She thought about the word manageable and everything it was asked to hold. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went to bed and she slept, genuinely and deeply, for the first time in 3 weeks. The 5th day was when it happened. She had gone to the harbor early, before Cal was fully operational, which she understood was not what she'd agreed to, but which she told herself was a 15-minute walk to a place she'd been 4 times already, and which was as safe as anything gets. The morning was still cool, the light just beginning to do its Maui thing with the water, and she was moving through the alley behind the market toward the coffee place when she heard a voice. She stopped. It was coming from behind a door left open at the back of a ground-floor unit, a storage space, or an office, something low-use and semi-private. 2 voices. One she didn't recognize, one she did. Ethan's voice. She stood very still. The morning was quiet enough that she could hear clearly, and what she heard was this, a conversation in shorthand, the kind of language that belongs to people who have been talking about the same subject for a long time, who have long since moved past explanation into efficiency. She heard the word timeline. She heard the word confirmation. She heard, clearly and without distortion, in Ethan's voice, the warm, specific, genuine-seeming voice, man who had looked at her across a dinner table and said, "I see it." She heard him say, "She trusts me. We're on schedule. When Devereaux comes for her, Hayes will be ready." The world did not tilt. It did not spin. It did something worse, which was that it went perfectly, crystallinely still, the stillness of a thing that has stopped pretending to be other than what it is. "She trusts me." Natalie stood in the alley with the morning light beginning to find the water and her hands very still at her sides, and she breathed slowly, once, twice, 3 times, and she did not make a sound. Hayes will be ready. She walked backward out of the alley. She turned. She walked to the villa at a pace that was not running because running would have been visible, would have been signal, and she understood, with a cold and sudden and total understanding, that she was not in Maui by accident, had not met Ethan Walker by accident, had not been given a week of warmth and legibility and safety by accident. She had been placed here, the way you place bait. She was inside the villa with the door locked before the shake reached her hands, and when it reached her hands, she pressed them flat against the kitchen counter and breathed through it, and looked at the wall and understood that the woman who had walked into that coffee shop on the second day thinking it was safe, thinking the distance was real, thinking the warmth was honest, that woman was gone now, had been stripped down to something rawer and less forgiving, something that would not make that category of error again. She picked up her phone. She called Cal first. She told him where she was and that she needed him at the villa immediately. She told him to come quietly. Then she called Vincent. He answered on the first ring. She said, "Ethan Walker. Find out who he really is. I think he works for Adrian Hayes." Her voice was level. She had made it level on purpose. "And Vincent, I think this was never about Hawaii. I think they wanted me here so they'd have something to use against." The phone was still in her hand when Cal came through the door. He moved through the villa fast and quiet, clearing rooms the way he'd been trained to clear rooms, corners first, then center, then confirmation. And when he came back to the kitchen where Natalie was standing with her palm flat on the counter, he looked at her face and understood immediately that the situation had moved past the category of precaution into something with sharper edges. "Vincent?" he said, calling him now. Vincent picked up before the second ring. She could hear the change in his breathing the moment she finished her sentence. That brief arrest, the intake, and then the return to controlled flatness that meant he was already moving, already thinking 3 steps past the information she'd given him. "Ethan Walker," he said. Not a question. She heard keys on a keyboard somewhere close to the phone. "That's what he called himself. I don't think that's his name. Where is he now?" "The harbor, or he was. 10 minutes ago." "Don't leave the villa. Cal stays on you. Pack nothing. If you need to move, you move without luggage." A pause. The keyboard. "Natalie." "I'm here?" "You did right calling immediately. Don't second-guess the next 10 minutes. Just follow Cal's instructions." She almost said something. She almost said the thing that was sitting in her chest, which was not quite fear and not quite anger, but something that lived between them, something hot and structural that she didn't have a clean word for yet. She didn't say it. "I know," she said instead. She hung up. Cal was already on his radio. Vincent had a name in 4 minutes. She found this out later, that it took his people exactly 4 minutes, from the moment she said Ethan Walker, to cross-reference the alias against a database she hadn't known existed and produce a real identity, a photograph, a history. His real name was Adrian Hayes, not an associate of Adrian Hayes, not an employee, not a soldier. Adrian Hayes himself, the son, the one who had parked outside the gate in a car with stolen plates, who had spent 12 years building toward this. He had not sent a proxy to befriend her. He had come himself, and he had been warm and specific and genuinely attentive. And Natalie thought about that as Cal moved her through the villa's back entrance into the vehicle that had appeared in the rear courtyard with a driver she didn't recognize but who Cal clearly did. She thought about the distinction between performance and intention, about whether a person could do something for strategic reasons and still feel it, and whether feeling it made the strategy more or less unforgivable. She didn't reach a conclusion. The car was moving. They were 40 minutes from the airport when her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at Cal. He nodded. She answered. "Natalie." The voice was Ethan's, Adrian's. The same warm tenor, the same unhurried quality, but stripped now of the particular gentleness he'd used over coffee and dinner. What was underneath was not cruel exactly, but it was unsparing. The voice of a man who has stopped performing. "Don't go to the airport." She kept her voice even. "Why not?" "Because if you get on that plane, I'll have to make the next part of this considerably less pleasant than it needs to be." Cal was looking at her. She held up one finger. "What do you want?" she asked. "What I've always wanted, what your husband took from me." A pause. She could hear wind on his end. Hosan. He was outside, moving. "I want Vincent to answer for what happened to my father. I want him in a room where the only exit requires him to give me something real. And I'm the room. You're the door," he said. "I'm sorry, for what it's worth. I wasn't expecting to." He stopped. The unfinished sentence sat between them, ugly in its implications. "That's not relevant. What's relevant is that I need you to turn around. And if I don't, then your sister is going to have a very difficult afternoon." The car went cold. Natalie's hand tightened on the phone. Cal saw it, and his body changed. The quality of his attention sharpened into something focused and edged. "If you touch Jess, I haven't touched anyone. I'm not—" His voice was flat now, the way Vincent's voice got flat when something required precision. "I'm not here to hurt civilians, but I need leverage that works, and your sister is leverage that works. I have people in Silver Cove. They're not there yet. Turn around and they stay not there." She looked at Cal. Cal's jaw was tight. He was already on a second phone, speaking low and fast. Silver Cove, she caught, and Whitmore, and now the word now pressed into the sentence with the weight of something that could not be delayed. "Where?" she said. "I'll send the address." A pause. "Come alone." "That's not completely alone. Bring Cal." I know you won't move without him, and I'm not interested in games about it. But no one else. No advanced teams. No Devereaux. His voice dropped. If I see Vincent Devereaux's people around that building before he arrives himself, the call to Silver Cove happens. Do you understand me? She understood him. Yes, she said. She ended the call. She looked at Cal. You heard? Most of it. We turn around. Natalie. We turn around, Cal. He looked at her with the expression of a man conducting a rapid and unhappy calculation. I need to call Vincent on the way, but we turn around first. She held his gaze. Jess, my mother, they're in that house. Cal turned around. He told the driver. He got Vincent on the phone while the car reversed course on the highway, and the ocean appeared again on the wrong side of the vehicle, blue and flat and enormous. The address was a warehouse district on the industrial edge of Maui's west coast, not tourist territory, not photographed from helicopter territory, the working underbelly of the island where shipping containers were stacked and the ground was oil-stained and the buildings were the color of old rust. The car pulled up at 3 in the afternoon and the sun was brutal and direct, and the warehouse they were directed to had its loading door open, darkness inside, the kind of darkness that is specifically constructed to give the people within it an advantage over anyone entering from bright daylight. Natalie got out of the car. Cal was beside her, one hand near his jacket, scanning the perimeter with the methodical thoroughness she'd come to read as a specific kind of vigilance. He's inside, she said. So are approximately 6 other people. I've counted 3 visible. How do you know? Shadows, 2 on the upper level. She looked at him. Vincent knows the address? He's been briefed. 40 minutes out, minimum, maybe more. Cal's voice was low and careful. He told me to keep you outside. Adrian will know if I stay outside. Yes. Then we go in. Cal said a word under his breath that was not a name or a place. Then he moved to her left side and they walked through the loading door together into the cooler dark of the warehouse. Adrian Hayes was standing in the center of the space. Up close, without the particular softness of the coffee place or the dinner restaurant, he was different. The same face, same lean build, same eyes that she'd read as attentive and honest. But now the ease was gone, stripped back, and what was underneath was something that had been under pressure for a very long time. He looked like a man who had organized his entire life around a single objective and was now standing at the moment of its execution and finding that the moment felt different than the years of preparation had suggested it would. He was not holding a weapon. His hands were at his sides. Around the perimeter of the warehouse, in the shadows, she could see the shapes of men who were. You came, he said. You gave me a reason. He nodded. He looked at Cal. Hands where I can see them, please. Cal complied, slowly, the compliance of a man filing everything for later use. Adrian looked back at Natalie. How long until Vincent gets here? I don't know. Don't do that. You know. 40 minutes, she said, maybe less. Something moved in Adrian's face. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has waited 12 years for 40 minutes and now finds that 40 minutes is both longer and shorter than he expected. Sit down, he said. He gestured at a wooden chair that had been placed in the middle of the space, isolated and deliberate. This isn't what you think it is. She didn't sit. What is it? A conversation. Forced, yes, but a conversation. Forced conversations with armed men in warehouses. I know how it looks. His voice was tight, controlled in the way of someone who is controlling it very hard. I know exactly how it looks. I've had 12 years to think about what this would look like. I didn't have a better option. You could have not done any of it. He killed my father. Your father was going to testify against people who... My father, Adrian said, and his voice cracked for a single syllable, just one before he forced it back to flat, was trying to get out. He went to the federal task force because he was scared and he wanted his family out of that world. He wasn't a saint, but he was trying. He breathed. And Vincent Devereaux had him killed for it. Natalie held his gaze. That's not what Vincent told me. Of course it's not. He said it was an accident, that someone acted without his instruction. Adrian's eyes went cold. Vincent Devereaux doesn't have people who act without his instruction. Everything in his organization runs through him. You've lived in his house for a month. Tell me I'm wrong. She couldn't tell him he was wrong. That was the problem. She stood in the rusted dark of the warehouse and she thought about the study and the measured voice and the way every person in that household moved with a calibrated awareness of where Vincent was at all times. And she could not honestly tell Adrian Hayes that his premise was impossible. What she didn't know was whether impossible and true were the same thing. "What happens when he gets here?" she asked. "I tell him what I told you. I give him the chance to answer for it honestly, in front of witnesses." Adrian's jaw was hard. "I'm not going to burn the world down. I just need him to say it. I need him to look at me and say that he made that call and that my father died because of it, and I need that on record." "And if he won't?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "He will." "What if he won't?" she said again. The silence that followed that was not comfortable. It was the silence of a man whose plan had a contingency he hadn't fully decided to use. She sat in the chair, not because he'd asked her to, because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness, and she thought better seated than standing, always had. But Vincent arrived in 31 minutes. She heard the vehicles before she heard anything else. 2 of them, from different angles, which meant he'd come from the main road and had a secondary position. Adrian's men registered this, and she could feel the tension in the warehouse ratcheting, the specific escalation of a room full of armed people when additional armed people arrived nearby. Adrian pulled out his phone. He looked at her. "Tell him to come in alone." She called Vincent. He picked up before it rang. "I'm outside, babe," he said. "He wants you to come in alone." A pause. The pause of a man looking at a building full of other men and making a calculation. "How many inside?" Cal said 6, maybe more. She kept her voice level. "Vincent, he says he wants a conversation." "I know what he wants. He's not—" She stopped. She looked at Adrian, who was watching her with the expression of a man listening very carefully to half of a conversation. "He's not irrational. He's angry, and he's been angry for a long time, and he wants to hear something from you directly. I don't think he wants to, Natalie," his voice was quiet, "move to the left side of the room, against the wall. Take Cal with you. Can you do that?" "Vincent, don't—" "I'm asking you to do one thing. Move to the wall." She looked at Cal. She stood up from the chair. Adrian watched her move but didn't stop her. His attention was on the loading door, on the daylight beyond it, on the shape of what was about to walk through it. Vincent Devereaux walked into the warehouse alone. He had left his jacket somewhere. He was in his shirt, sleeves down, and he walked into the darkness of the warehouse with the unhurried, particular stride of a man entering a room he owns, even when he doesn't own it, even when the room is full of other men's weapons and another man's fury. He walked until he was 12 feet from Adrian Hayes, and he stopped. The 2 men looked at each other. Natalie had her back against the left wall with Cal beside her, and she watched this. The 50-year-old and the 30-year-old, the man who had built an empire, and the boy who'd been left outside it when his father died, look at each other across 12 feet of oil-stained concrete, and the air between them was the densest thing in the building. "You came alone," Adrian said. "You asked me to." "I thought you'd send people. I don't hide behind a people when someone asks me to answer for something." Vincent looked at him steadily. "Say what you came to say." Adrian's jaw worked. He'd been building toward this moment for 12 years, and now that it was here, the script he'd rehearsed was meeting the reality of the man in front of him, and the 2 things were not a perfect fit. "You had my father killed. Your father was going to testify against people who would have spent the rest of their lives dismantling everything I'd built and putting my people in cells. He made a choice, and his choice had consequences." Vincent's voice was level. "What happened to Richard was not something I ordered. I ordered a conversation. What happened in that room, don't." Adrian's voice split. "Don't give me the 'I ordered a conversation' version. I have been hearing versions of that story for 12 years. I've talked to the man who was in that room. I know what was said before the shot was fired. I know your guy asked your father if Vincent sent a message, and my father said yes, and the message was the shot." He was breathing hard now, the composed exterior fracturing along old fault lines. "Don't stand in front of me and tell me it was out of your hands." "Mo ti oxtaman." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. The warehouse breathed around him. The slight sounds of men trying not to make sounds. The distant noise of the island beyond the corrugated walls. "No," he said. "It wasn't out of my hands." The room went absolutely still. Natalie's breath stopped. "I gave an instruction that I knew could be interpreted two ways," Vincent said. "I knew my man, I knew how he operated under pressure, and I gave an instruction that allowed for both interpretations because I was—" He stopped. He looked at Adrian Hayes with the eyes of a man who has carried something for a very long time and is now, for the first time, setting it on a surface between himself and another person. "Because I was afraid of what your father's testimony would do, and I told myself I was giving him a choice. I told myself the outcome depended on what he said in that room. But I knew what my man would do if your father confirmed the testimony." He breathed. "I knew, and I gave the instruction anyway, and Richard Hayes is dead because of that. That is the truth." Adrian Hayes made a sound. It was not a word. It was something underneath words, something that had been compressed for 12 years in the chest of a boy who watched his father get loaded into a bag and his family loaded into a government vehicle and his world closed like a book. And hearing the truth, actual truth, from the man responsible for it did not feel the way he had expected it to feel. It felt worse. It felt like the grief could finally arrive because there was nothing left to fight on its behalf. He lifted the phone in his hand. "Lower the—" Cal started. "It's a phone," Adrian said, his voice wrecked. "It's just a phone." He dialed. A single ring. A voice answered, and he said, "Stand down. Everyone stand down. Silver Cove, stand down." He ended the call. His arm dropped to his side. Vincent didn't move. He stood in the center of the warehouse, and he watched Adrian Hayes with an expression that Natalie had never seen on his face. Something exposed. Something that had been reached by a specific kind of pain. The pain of a man who has finally heard his own accounting spoken aloud and found that honesty, after years of managed silence, is its own form of wound. And then from the upper level a figure moved. Not Adrian's men. Someone else. Someone who had been there before Adrian's people arrived. Someone who had been waiting, who had been patient, who had understood that the moment Vincent Devereaux came alone into a building to answer for something he'd done, that was the moment his defenses were at their lowest and his position was most exposed. Natalie saw the figure a half-second before Cal did. Cal moved, threw himself sideways, hit Vincent hard enough to carry both of them out of the line. And the shot that came from the upper level hit the concrete where Vincent had been standing and sent fragments spraying, and Natalie dropped to the floor on pure instinct, the shock of it hitting her nervous system before the sound did. Cal was up again in 2 seconds, weapon drawn, scanning the upper level. Adrian was shouting at his own men. Not the shooter, not his voice carrying the specific panic of a man whose plan has just been hijacked by someone else's. Vincent was on his feet. There was blood on his forearm. Fragment, not a bullet, a graze. But he was standing and his eyes were moving, and he had the absolute presence of a man who has been in rooms like this before and knows how to be inside the chaos rather than overwhelmed by it. "Natalie," his voice carried across the noise. "Here." She was against the wall. "I'm here." His eyes found her. Held for 1 second. Something passed in them, fast and unguarded. Something she had never seen there before. Then he was moving. The shooter on the upper level had repositioned. One of Adrian's people, or someone who had inserted themselves into Adrian's operation without Adrian's knowledge, which the expression on Adrian's face suggested was exactly what had happened. Adrian was running toward the far wall, shouting into his phone. The architecture of his planned confrontation collapsed around him. Cal was moving toward the stairs to the upper level. Vincent crossed the warehouse floor. He reached Natalie and put one hand on her arm. Brief, grounding. The hand of a man confirming that the thing he came here for is intact. And she could feel through his grip that he was running high. Adrenaline and controlled fury in equal proportion. The combination she'd seen in his stillness but never in his body until now. "Can you run?" he said. "Yes." Then the loading door darkened. 3 men in the entrance, not Adrian's. Something else, something organized and prepared and present in numbers that had not been here 30 minutes ago, which meant someone had been running a second operation inside Adrian's plan, which meant the warehouse was not a location Adrian Hayes had chosen, but a location someone had chosen for him. Vincent turned to face the door. He looked at the three men. He looked at the warehouse. He looked at the space between where he was standing and where the rear exit was, through the dark to the back wall, 60 feet of open floor. He turned back to Natalie, and his voice was very quiet and very clear. When I move, you move with me. You stay on my left side. You don't stop for anything. She looked at him. His gray eyes in the dark of the warehouse, the blood on his forearm, the absolute unblinking calm of a man who has decided. I know, she said. He moved. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something that could be assembled afterward into clean sequential narrative. It was heat and sound and motion, the particular organized violence of a man who had built a criminal empire, not from a chair, but from a long history of being present in exactly these kinds of rooms and surviving them. Vincent Devereaux fought through the warehouse the way water moves through a cracked structure, finding paths, using angles, creating space where there wasn't space, and the men between him and the exit discovered, one by one and at significant personal cost, that the reputation of the most feared mafia boss on the West Coast was not a thing that had been constructed from a desk. Cal had cleared the upper level. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs as Vincent reached the rear exit, the 3-second window of alignment that allowed all of them to move through the door together, into the alley behind the warehouse, into the brutal afternoon sunlight. Vincent's vehicles were 30 meters north. They ran. Behind them, the warehouse was producing sounds that suggested the situation inside had not resolved itself calmly, and ahead of them was the coastal road and the car and the airport and the mainland, and Natalie ran with Vincent's hand on her arm and the blood on his forearm and the sun hitting everything like an accusation, and she thought, in the fractured, half-formed way of someone whose entire nervous system is committed to movement, that she had spent 4 weeks in this man's life thinking she understood the ledger of what he was. She understood now that she had been reading a single page. The car doors closed. The driver was already moving before they were fully in. The road opened up ahead of them, and the ocean appeared on the left side, vast and flat, and completely indifferent, and Vincent sat in the seat beside her with his forearm pressed against his thigh, and his breathing controlled and his eyes forward, and she looked at him and thought about what he'd said in the warehouse, the words he hadn't had to say, the truth he'd put between himself and Adrian Hayes without anyone asking him. The car didn't slow until they were on the H-36 heading east, the warehouse district shrinking in the rear view, the ocean back on the right side where it belonged. Vincent's forearm had stopped bleeding. Natalie had pressed her scarf against it in the first 60 seconds of driving, without being asked, without discussion, and he had let her, which was its own form of language between them now, the language of people who have been through something together and found, on the other side of it, that the distance they'd been maintaining was no longer structurally necessary. She held the scarf against the wound and looked at his profile and said nothing for a long time. The driver navigated without speaking. Cal was in the front passenger seat with his phone pressed to his ear, issuing quiet instructions to people in Silver Cove, in San Francisco, in places Natalie didn't know about and was not certain she needed to. "Your arm," she said. "It's fine." "Let me see." He turned his forearm slightly. The fragment had cut a shallow diagonal, ugly but not deep, the kind of wound that bleeds impressively and heals without drama. She pressed the scarf back against it. "The shooter," she said. "Not Adrian's." "No." "Victoria." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet." "You suspect." "I suspect," he said, that Victoria Sinclair understood that Adrian Hayes was building towards something and positioned herself inside his operation without his knowledge. She funded the original Hawaii arrangement, not the trip itself, the introduction. He looked straight ahead. "Ethan Walker, Adrian Hayes. He wouldn't have known how to get close to you that way. He'd been building toward a confrontation for 12 years, but the social engineering, the coffee shop, the warmth, the specific targeting of what you needed, that was someone else's blueprint." Natalie thought about the screen door that stuck, the book on the table, the way Adrian as Ethan had looked up with the acknowledging nod of one solo traveler to another, so natural, so apparently unrehearsed. "She designed him," Natalie said. "She designed the approach. He executed it." A pause. "He felt it. That wasn't performance, what happened between you. I think that was real for him, which is why the thing in the warehouse was what it was. He couldn't use you the way Victoria intended because he'd... Vincent stopped. His jaw was tight. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. He looked at her then, briefly, the gray eyes in the afternoon light. I know. The road curved and the ocean disappeared, and they were moving through the interior of the island, green and deep, the landscape indifferent to everything that had just happened in the warehouse district 4 miles back. What happens to Adrian? She asked. Nothing. From me. His voice was even. He came in good faith. His operation was compromised from inside, but that's not on him. He made his call to Silver Cove before the shooting started. He turned his forearm, and she let him, watching his face as he looked at the wound. What he does next is his choice. He has the truth now. That's what he came for. Is that enough for him? Vincent was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence stopped being a pause and started being an answer. I don't know, he said finally. I hope so. They flew back to the mainland that evening. Cal had arranged everything, a private departure, the kind that bypassed the visible parts of the airport and its procedural delays, the kind that Natalie was still adjusting to as a feature of her current life. She sat in a leather seat across from Vincent and watched the island fall away below them through the oval window and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 6 hours and is only now discovering what lives underneath it. What lived underneath it was grief. Not dramatic grief, not the kind that announces itself with clarity. Just the dull and ordinary grief of a woman who had spent 4 years building her life around a man who had been using her the entire time, and had only now, sitting at altitude above the Pacific, fully arrived at the understanding that there was no version of that story in which Logan Pierce had ever loved her. She had known this intellectually since the conversation in Vincent's study. She had known it in the warehouse when Adrian said the name of the organization that had manufactured her sister's debt, and she had put Logan at the center of it and understood the geometry. But intellectual knowledge and arrived grief are different countries, and she had crossed the border somewhere over the water. She didn't cry. She sat with her hand against the window glass and breathed and let the grief be what it was without trying to manage it into something smaller. Vincent watched her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer the kind of comfort that would have required her to perform recovery before she'd actually recovered. He simply occupied the same space and let the silence be useful. After a while, she said, without looking away from the window, "Did you know about Logan before you married me?" Vincent took a moment. "I knew he was connected to Pacific Meridian. I didn't know the full depth of it." "But you knew enough." "I knew enough to believe the situation was designed, that your sister's debt was not random." He paused. "I didn't know at the time that Adrian Hayes was the architect. I thought it was a Pacific Meridian operation with Logan as a local asset. The Hayes connection took longer to trace. But you knew Logan was part of it." "Yes." She turned from the window. She looked at him directly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling you that your partner of 4 years was complicit in the debt that brought you to me, on the day of our wedding or the week after, would have looked, regardless of its truth, like a man trying to cement a position." He met her eyes without flinching. "I needed you to be able to see it independently. Through evidence you found yourself, so you'd know it was real." She sat with that. "The hotel photograph," she said. "Victoria, outside the restaurant. That was 3 months before the wedding." "Yes. You saw her coming. You knew she'd be a factor." "I knew Victoria well enough to know that my marriage to someone else would not be something she accepted passively." His voice was dry, not bitter. "I underestimated how far she'd go." "The shooter in the warehouse. We'll know more as the morning. My people are running the full connection now. If Victoria funded or directed that shot, there will be evidence. She's brilliant, but she leaves financial fingerprints. She always has." Natalie looked at him. The plane hummed around them. Cal was asleep in the back, which she suspected was a professional discipline rather than an emotional state. "Vincent." He waited. "In the warehouse. What you said to Adrian." She stopped, chose the words carefully. "You didn't have to say it. I know. You had leverage in that room. You could have... I know what I could have done." His voice was not sharp. It was just accurate. "I'm aware of the options." "Why?" He looked at her for a moment. and the expression on his face was the same one she'd caught at the corner of his mouth the night she'd demanded a cleaner answer about Victoria, the night she'd sat across from him at the dinner table and refused to accept not enough. The expression of a man who has been contained for so long that the act of not being contained is something he has to decide on deliberately, like choosing to open a door that has been closed for a very long time. Because he deserved it, Vincent said. Because 12 years of wrong deserved the truth more than my position deserved protecting. He paused. And because you were in the room. She held his gaze. Why does that matter? He looked at her steadily. You know why it matters. She looked back at the window. The ocean below was dark and featureless and everywhere. Yes, she thought. She knew. They landed in Silver Cove at 11 at night. The house on the bluff was lit from inside. Rosa had left lights on, which she always did when Vincent was expected home late. A small domestic gesture that had struck Natalie as surprisingly human the first time she'd noticed it. The gate opened as the car came up the road, and Natalie looked at the house and felt, for the first time, something she hadn't expected to feel. Relief. Not the relief of someone returning to a prison that is at least familiar. The relief of someone returning to a place that has, without her fully noticing, become associated with safety. She got out of the car and stood on the drive and breathed the coastal night air, salt and dark, and listened to the Pacific below the bluff. Rosa appeared at the door. She looked at Vincent's arm, which he'd re-wrapped with a bandage from the car's kit, and she made a sound that conveyed, with economy, both relief and disapproval. She disappeared toward the kitchen. Vincent stood beside Natalie on the drive for a moment. They looked at the house. I'll have Cal run the full Victoria connection in the morning, he said. If the evidence supports what I think it supports, she'll be handled through federal channels. I won't... He stopped. I won't use my organization for it. For this particular thing, I want it on record. Why? Because Adrian deserves to know the full picture, too. His operation was compromised by someone he didn't know was inside it. That matters to the shape of what happened to his father. He paused. I'll reach out to him, through proper channels, if that exists between us. If he'll receive it. She looked at him. You're going to try to make it right. I can't make it right. What happened to Richard Hayes can't be made right. His voice was flat with honesty, not with coldness. But I can make the subsequent 12 years more accurate. I can make sure Adrian Hayes has the full picture instead of a partial one that someone else has been selectively feeding him. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Logan. Vincent's jaw tightened. Logan Pierce has been in federal custody since 4 this afternoon. He looked at her face carefully. I turned everything we had on Pacific Meridian over to a federal task force 3 weeks ago. His connection to the organization, the financial structures, the communication records, it's enough. He won't be able to arrange anything from where he is. Natalie was quiet for a long time. She thought about the apartment, the Thai place on Fridays, the careful, patient voice. She thought about sitting across from him on the night she'd told him about the letter and watching his face and reading it as concern, as partnership, as love. She thought about what it meant to spend 4 years inside a performance that precise. He wasn't always like that, she said, not defending him, just trying to be accurate. Or I couldn't tell the difference, which is his fault, Vincent said quietly, not yours. She looked at him. You should have let me hate him at my own pace. I know. I'm saying it so you know I know. I know that too. The corner of his mouth moved barely. You're very particular about knowing things. One of us has to be. Something shifted in his face. Not the barely there mouth movement that might have been amusement. Something deeper, something that had been working its way to the surface since the warehouse and had now arrived. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her when his eyes found her across the warehouse floor. When the shooting had stopped and she was against the wall and he'd crossed the space between them and put his hand on her arm. Not possessively, not claiming, just confirming that she was real and intact and present. He said, Natalie. She waited. I need to say something that I should have said sooner. Okay, what I asked of you, what I arranged, the wedding, the marriage, even with the intent to protect you, it was wrong. He said it the way he'd said things to Adrian in the warehouse, without hedge, without the softening clause that would have made it easier to say, and therefore less true. You didn't have a real choice. I told myself the circumstances gave you no choice, regardless of me, And that's accurate, but it is an absolution. You deserved a real choice, and I didn't give you one. The coastal wind came off the water and moved through the drive. Natalie stood with it on her face and let the words do what they needed to do, which was settle. Not fix, not erase, but settle into the true shape of what this had been and what it had cost. No, she said. I didn't have a choice. He accepted that. He didn't offer anything else. But I'm standing here, she said. He looked at her. I'm standing on my own driveway at midnight after a genuinely terrible week in Hawaii, and my arm isn't bleeding, and my sister is safe, and my mother's house is still standing, and I'm standing here looking at a man who walked into a warehouse full of guns because someone asked him to answer for something. She stopped. I have opinions about that man. They've been changing. I wanted you to know. Very slowly, something happened to Vincent Devereaux's face that she had not seen there before, that she suspected very few people had ever seen there, because it required a lowering of defenses that he had spent a long time building for very good reasons. He looked for a moment like a man who had not expected kindness and had been reached by it anyway. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Rosa appeared at the door again and said something about food being ready whenever, her tone implying that she had opinions about people standing on driveways at midnight when there was a perfectly functional kitchen with heat. They went inside. The next 3 weeks moved differently than the first 3 had. The investigation into Victoria Sinclair produced, as Vincent had predicted, financial fingerprints. She had funded the second shooter through a shell company registered in Nevada, connected to a property investment firm she'd been running under a different name for 6 years. She had inserted herself into Adrian Hayes' operation 12 months earlier, providing funding and logistical support while withholding from Adrian the crucial fact that her objective was not justice for his father, but the permanent elimination of Vincent Devereaux and the extraction of the organization's financial infrastructure in the resulting chaos. Adrian Hayes, when he was presented with this information through Cal, acting as an intermediary, was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "She told me she was helping me because she understood what it was to be pushed out of Vincent's life." His voice, Cal reported, was flat, with the particular flatness of someone whose wound has been reopened in a direction they hadn't anticipated. She used my father. He agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation. He provided his own financial records, his communication with Victoria, everything he had. It was the kind of cooperation that came from a man who had discovered that the operation of his grief had been manipulated by someone else for someone else's ends, and who found that this final understanding, that even his revenge had been made into a tool, was the thing that finally exhausted the anger completely. Natalie heard about this through Vincent, who told her over breakfast on a Tuesday, matter-of-factly, the way he'd begun telling her things over breakfast. Not debriefing, not reporting, but sharing, which was a different thing entirely. Victoria was arrested in Portland. The federal case was clean and substantial, and she was not, it turned out, as invisible as she'd believed herself to be. She had made one significant error in her 12 months of planning, which was that she had underestimated the competence of the organization she was trying to take apart. Organizations built by people like Vincent Devereaux survive because every person inside them is trained to watch for exactly the kind of slow, patient infiltration Victoria had attempted. Logan Pierce pled guilty to 4 charges. Natalie read about it in a news summary on her phone while she was on her break at the hotel, and she sat with the article for a few minutes without particularly reading it, and then she put her phone away and went back to work. Delia brought tamales that Thursday. Natalie ate 3 bastam lechos seki. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, 4 weeks after Hawaii. They were on her desk in the room on the east side of the second floor, the room she'd stopped thinking of as her room and started thinking of as the room, because the distinction between hers and the rest of the house had been eroding in ways she hadn't cataloged or decided upon, just noticed after the fact. Rosa had placed them there without comment, which meant Vincent had asked her to, which meant he had arranged them and placed them in her space because he'd understood that the decision had to come to her rather than being put before her in a room where he was present. She sat at the desk and looked at them. They were already signed on his side, his signature, precise and unelaborate, at the bottom of the final page. Everything was in order. The financial terms were generous in the way of a man who was not trying to owe her anything or make her feel owed. a settlement that was clean and fair and asked nothing. She turned the pages slowly. She read what she was holding. She sat with it. Then she picked up the papers and she went downstairs. Vincent was in the study. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and his face was very still. The specific stillness of a man who has prepared himself for a particular outcome and is now confirming whether he prepared correctly. She walked to his desk and she set the papers on it. She had torn them, not dramatically, no rage, no statement, just carefully, methodically, into quarters, the way you destroy something that doesn't need to exist anymore. She set the 4 pieces on his desk and she stood there with her arms at her sides and she looked at him. He looked at the pieces. Then he looked at her. "Natalie, I'm not leaving," she said. "I want to be clear that I'm not leaving because I feel like I can't. I'm not leaving because of the settlement or the house or because I don't have options." She kept her voice even. She'd been working out how to say this for 3 days, ever since she'd understood that the papers were coming and that her answer to them was not what she would have predicted 4 weeks ago. "I'm staying because I want to. That's a choice I'm making with information I've earned, and I need you to know the difference." Vincent was very still. "Okay," she said. That's what I needed to say. She turned to leave. "Natalie?" She stopped. She heard him stand. She heard him come around the desk, which he rarely did. He was a man who stayed on his side of surfaces, who maintained the physical courtesy of space, even when the emotional space had been contracting for weeks. She heard him stop directly behind her. She turned around. He was close enough that she could see the things his face did when he wasn't managing it, the way it was not managed now, the way he was looking at her with the eyes of a man who has held himself back from something for a very long time and is now standing at the decision point of whether to continue holding back. "I need to say something too," he said. His voice was lower than usual, not soft. That wasn't the right word for anything about Vincent Devereaux. But lower, more interior. "From the beginning, I told myself I married you to protect you, because of your father, because of what I owed him." He paused. That was true. And it was also, after the first week, after watching you fight for the right to keep your job, and the right to not use my money, and the right to live in this house on your own terms. He stopped. He looked at her with those gray eyes that gave very little away, and that she had learned over 8 weeks to read not as coldness, but as the careful management of something that ran very deep. It was also something else. "I know," she said. "I should have—" "I know," she said again. "I know what it was. I've known for a while." She looked at him. "I was just waiting for the ground to stop moving." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Both hands. The way you hold something you've almost lost. And she let him, and they stood in the study of the house on the bluff, while the Pacific moved below them, and the morning came through the windows and lay on the floor between them. And the silence was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who have arrived, finally, at the same place at the same time. Months passed. The house changed, not dramatically. Rosa's kitchen remained Rosa's kingdom. Cal and Brennan remained fixtures of the perimeter. The study remained Vincent's primary habitat. But the East Side room acquired a different quality, because Natalie spent less time in it than she used to, having migrated, gradually and without announcement, to the spaces of the house that they shared. Her real estate license cleared in October. She began working with a firm in Silver Cove that specialized in coastal properties, which meant she drove herself to appointments and came home with dirt on her shoes from walking sites, and talked about square footage and listing prices over dinner with the specific animation of a person doing work they'd chosen. Vincent listened with the attention of a man who finds the things a person loves interesting because he finds the person interesting, which is a specific and rare form of listening. Jess came for dinner twice a month. She had stopped apologizing for the debt and started being simply present instead, which was better for everyone. She and Vincent had developed cautiously and with mutual suspicion that slowly became mutual respect, something that resembled a working understanding. He was not warm with her in the way he wasn't warm with most people. She was not deferential in the way she wasn't deferential with most people. They occupied the dinner table with a kind of armed neutrality that had, over months, lost most of its armor. Carol came on Sundays. She sat in the kitchen with Rosa and drank coffee and was not impressed by the house, which Rosa found hilarious, and which Vincent found, to Natalie's considerable amusement, vaguely unsettling. They went back to Hawaii in December. Not Maui, the Big Island, somewhere without the weight of what Maui had become. They stayed in a place on the Kohala coast with black lava rock meeting blue water, and they were not on a schedule, not managing anything, not in the process of becoming anything other than what they already were. On the second morning, Natalie was standing at the edge of the water where the lava met the ocean. Not a beach, exactly, just the place where the island ended and the Pacific began. And Vincent came and stood beside her. He had coffee. He handed her a cup. They stood there for a while. The water was the same water, the same Pacific she'd looked at from the window of the mansion when the ground kept shifting under her. The same water her father had worked beside for 30 years and had talked about with the tone of a man who respected something large. The same water that had been outside every window of her life in Silver Cove, constant and indifferent and always present. She thought about the letter on the kitchen counter and her mother's hand pressing flat against it. She thought about the civil attorney's office and the blue dress and the word yes spoken into a silence she hadn't understood yet. She thought about the warehouse and the shot that had hit the concrete and Cal's body moving fast between the bullet and Vincent's hand on her arm after, brief and grounding and completely honest. She thought about the torn papers on the desk. My father knew, she said, what you'd become. He knew what kind of man he was leaving us in the care of. Vincent was quiet for a moment. He knew what kind of world he was leaving you adjacent to. He wanted someone inside it who would make choices in your direction. And did you? Always? He looked at her. The morning light was direct and he didn't look away from it. Not always. I made choices I'm not proud of. I made choices your father would have argued with. I made the choice about Richard Hayes that gave a 17-year-old boy 12 years of damage to carry. He looked back at the water. I can't tell you I've been something I haven't been. I know that. Then why? Because you knew the difference, she said, between what you were and what you should have been. That's not nothing. She looked at his profile against the Pacific. Most people who do the things you've done decide the things you've done are fine. You never decided that. He was quiet for a long time. The water moved below them and the light shifted and a bird crossed the horizon line and disappeared. Your father, he said, was a better man than me in most of the ways that matter. He was, she agreed. He also loved deeply and worked hard and told the truth when it was inconvenient and came to you when he was scared because he trusted you. And you were there when we needed you. That's not nothing either. Vincent looked at her. She looked back at him. She had married him in a blue dress in an attorney's office with resentment in her chest and a debt cleared overnight, and a choice that had been, at the time, the narrowest possible corridor. She had lived in his house with her arms crossed and her independence intact and her judgment on high, and she had watched him, month by month, day by day, scene by ordinary and extraordinary scene. And what she had found was not what she'd been prepared to resist, or what she'd expected to find, or what the photograph in the news post, or Victoria Sinclair's archway presence, or any version of the story she'd been telling herself had suggested she'd find. She had found a man who kept his word, who told the truth when it cost him, who had carried a wrong for 12 years without making peace with it, and who had walked into a warehouse alone because the alternative required him to be something he'd decided, somewhere, and at some point, not to be. She reached over and took the hand that wasn't holding a coffee cup. He looked down at her hand in his. Then he looked at her. Something in his face was the same thing she'd seen in the study. The same thing the gray eyes had held when she'd set the torn papers on his desk and said, I want to be clear. The look of a man who has been reached, genuinely and finally, in the place where he'd stopped expecting to be reached. He turned his hand so that hers was properly held, and they stood at the edge of the Pacific in the December light. Not newlyweds, not strangers, not a transaction, not a protection arrangement, not a story someone else had designed around them. Just two people standing on volcanic rock at the end of an island, held by the particular and irreducible fact of each other, looking at the same enormous water and finding, for the first time in either of their lives, that the ground beneath them had stopped moving. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the thing they had each, in their separate and damaged and complicated ways, been standing for.